The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "It is impossible for a person to mount two horses or to stretch two bows. And it is impossible for a servant to serve two masters. Otherwise, he will honor the one and treat the other contemptuously. No one drinks old wine and immediately desires to drink new wine. And new wine is not put into old wineskins lest they burst, nor is old wine put into new wineskins lest it spoil it. An old patch is not sewn onto a new garment because a tear would result." Jesus says, "If two make peace with each other in a single house, they will say to the mountain, 'Move from here,' and it will move." Jesus says, "Blessed are the solitary and elect, for they will find the kingdom. For you are from it, and to it you will return." Jesus says, "If they say to you, 'Where have you come from?' say to them, 'We have come from the light, from the place where light came into being by itself.' If they say to you, 'Is it you?' say, 'We are its children, and we are children of the chosen children of the living Father.' If they ask you, 'What is the evidence of your Father in you?' say to them, 'It is motion and it is rest.'" His disciples said to him, "When will the rest for the dead take place? And when will the new world come?" He said to them, "What you are looking forward to has already come, but you do not recognize it." A gospel inspired by God. Sunday next is a Palm Sunday. It's also the second Sunday of the month, so it's the Kids' Mass. And to add even more glory to it, we're going to have a baptism. We're going to baptize a little baby girl called Lucy Abando. So it's going to be a great celebration. Now the interesting thing is, Lucy, the name Lucy comes from lux or lucia in Latin, which means light. And so she's a being of light, as all little babies are. They're beings of light. And so the ceremony, as I think about it next Sunday, it'll involve giving her officially her name, recognizing that she is light, and then trying to ask the community, will you support the parents in helping to raise this child and bring this child to full wakefulness during the course of her life? Because there are going to be lots of competing energies. You know, the media, the political system, the school systems, they'll all have agendas for little Lucy Abando, and they'll all be trying to keep her asleep. And the job of the community is, and our parents is, to try to wake her up to who she really, really is. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to just make three main points this morning. I'm going to ask myself three questions. And the first question is, what is your name? Second question, are you a child of the light? And thirdly, how awake do you want to become? So the first question is, what is your name? Unfortunately, we live in a culture in the West where names are kind of being brushed out and they're being replaced with numbers. So for instance, if they put you in jail, you don't have a name anymore, you merely have a number. Or even when you apply for Social Security, you're not a name anymore, you're a number. You get a number, that's how you're tagged. You try to open a bank account, you don't have a name anymore, you get a number. Even if you go to Whole Foods and you're waiting in line to be served, they give you a number. So it's all about numbers. We've reduced everything to numbers. But naming is not about giving somebody a number, and it is not just an identity tag to kind of differentiate between Tom and Dick and Harry or Mary or Julie. A name is not just an identity tag. A name is the sacred song that your soul sang as it was wending its way into incarnation. So if you really know your name, you know who you are and you know what your purpose is. But most of us don't know what our names are. We think we are the name that's on our baptismal certificate. That's not who you are. Your name actually defines who you are, and it defines what your mission is. The name that your soul sang as it wound its way into incarnation actually gave shape to your incarnation. It determined the form you were going to take, whether you were going to be born as a lily or a rock or a dinosaur or a human being. It was the name that decided what form you were going to take. And it was the name that decided what your purpose was going to be in a particular incarnation. And so when you read through the great wisdom traditions, they all realize that. So a name was very, very sacred. A name was not just an identity tag. And that is the reason why God refuses, to divulge her name. There's a great story in the book of Exodus where the God of the Israelites is trying to persuade Moses to go back into Egypt, where Moses is wanted for murder, and tell the people that he's going to set them free. And Moses had used up all kinds of arguments because he didn't want to go back. And finally, when he ran out of all arguments, he says to God, I don't even know who you are. When I go back and I say to them, your God tells me to come back because he's going to set you free, and they say, what God are you talking about? What am I going to say to them? What's your name? And God replies in Hebrew, Ehia, Ashir, Ehia, which is always mistranslated into English as I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a linguistic device called predication without a verb. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. You can't say it in Swahili either. You have to get around it by, predication without a verb. So God actually used the future tense. What he said was, Ehia, Ashir, Ehia, I will be who I will be. In other words, he was telling Moses, mind your own bloody business. I would be whatever the occasion demands I be in a situation. Because to know somebody's name in that system was to have power over them. And that's what we mean by taking God's name in vain. It's not that you're cursing or swearing falsely, it's that you're trying to manipulate God and God's power for a particular purpose. So God refused to give any name. Which is why, strictly speaking, in Hebrew, the way God is referred to is as Hashem. And Hashem just literally means the name. So when you talk about God in Hebrew, you're either going to call him Adonai, which just means the Lord, or if you're going to try to give some kind of a name, you just call him the name, Hashem. So God refuses to give up his name. Now God names stuff, God calls stuff into being through naming these kinds. So it's very interesting to watch how names are given in the Bible. So our first father is given the name Adam. And very, very often, the names represent real realities. And often they're puns. So Adam comes from the Hebrew word Adamah. And Adamah means earth or soil. So it's a pun. So to say that Adam came from Adamah is like saying the earthling came from earth. Or the human came from humus. It's a pun in Hebrew. Because God fashioned this being from the clay of the earth itself. So that was the name that was given to the first father. The first mother was called in Hebrew Chava. Now Chava comes from the Hebrew word Chai, which means life. And so Chava represents the vitalizing force. And as I say sometimes when I'm doing marriages, the man represents groundedness or the clod, and the woman represents the kind of vitalizing principle. And if there's only the male on his own, he's this dead clod. If there's only the woman on her own, she's this esoteric flake. When you bring the two of them together, you've got a real human being. And so the real human being is both male and female. You're not a real human being until you've developed both sides of yourself. So that was the name that were given to our first parents. Then they were given the job of naming all of the animals. And it's not like they stood in the garden and saw this thing with a big long neck coming through, and somebody says, what are we going to call that? And Eve says, lion? No, it doesn't suit. What about twiga? So they called it twiga. Twiga is the Swahili word for a giraffe. So it's not that they're just, give name tags to what was passing in front of them. They recognize the essence of each of the animals. And that's what it means that they named them. It's not that they gave identity tags, so they could separate a hyena from a coyote. That's what it wasn't about. It was that they understood the essence of each of these creatures because they were companions to them. They weren't food sources at that stage. It was only later they'd become food sources. They were companions on their journey. And so they had to recognize the essence of each of these animals. And that's what it meant that they gave them names. Throughout the Bible, then, you find that names have a huge significance. So this character that we call Abraham was originally known as Abram. But when God decided to make him the father of many nations, he changed the name from Abram to Abraham. And it's a pun in Hebrew again. It means, Abraham means the father of many nations. For Ab just means father. And so he's indicating, what the function or what the mission of this man is going to be by changing his name. Often in the Bible you get people giving themselves names to kind of represent what their function is. So the famous prophet Elijah, in Hebrew, the name is Eliyahu. And again, Eliyahu literally means Yahweh is my God. And Elijah flourished about 800 years before Christ, at a time when Judaism was going into schism. They were beginning to follow other gods, because at that stage they weren't monotheistic. And the God they had followed had proven to be a really good warrior God, but he didn't know diddly squat about agriculture. And so there was just drought after drought after drought. So they figured they needed to change their allegiance and follow a different God, somebody who knew something about agriculture, planting and rain and stuff like that. So they're going after a God called the Baal. And this individual stood up and said, I don't care what you guys are going to do, I tell you what I'm doing, I'm going to follow Yahweh. He's going to continue to be my God. And so he called himself Eliyahu, which just literally means in Hebrew, my God is Yahweh. So he gives himself a name. You find in the Bible that people are given nicknames, and Jesus is actually very good at nicknaming people, which tells me that he had a tremendous sense of humor. And so, for instance, when he met Simon for the first time, he said, you are Peter. I'm going to call you Peter, the rock. Some rock he proved to be. So Christ knew exactly what he was dealing with, but he called him the rock. I think he was punning. I think he was joking, because he knew that Peter was anything but stable. But he called him the rock. When he met the two sons of Zebedee, he called them Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, because these were real dynamic, go-getter kinds of guys. So he called them Boanerges. So he's constantly giving people nicknames. So nicknames are a way of identifying some feature of somebody, exaggerating wildly, and you can be poking fun at them, or you can be recognizing real characteristics. So for instance, in Ireland, we did a lot of nicknaming in kids, and sometimes it was kind of cruel. There was a woman who lived near where I grew up with my grandparents, and she was known by everybody as Wheezy Hartnett. She had asthma, and she was constantly wheezing. She was called Wheezy Hartnett, and that's everybody knew her as Wheezy Hartnett. Whether she referred to herself as that, I have no idea. But I have no idea what her real name was. Her surname was Hartnett, but everybody knew her as Wheezy Hartnett. There was another guy who lived near us, and he was called Pat the Yank. Now, a lot of people in our area emigrated to the United States, and most of them never came back. Or maybe it would be 40 years before they come back, before they could afford to it. But this guy only survived 6 months, and then he came back to Ireland. He was living in our little street. But he was an expert in all things Americana. He was the go-to person. If you wanted to know anything about America, this was the guy. And so he was called facetiously Pat the Yank, because he knew more about America after 6 months than the other guys did after 40 years. So you find this happening in all cultures. In the Kalenjin people that I lived with, when a woman got married, she was given a nickname, depending on her character. So a woman might be called Tabarngetun, which means the one who killed the lion. And it wasn't that she was out in the bush with a spear looking for Simba. It wasn't that. It was that she married a guy who had a real reputation for being a fireball, and she tamed him. And so she'd be called by her girlfriends Tabarngetun, the one who quieted or tamed the lion. Or she might be called Tabelga, which meant the one who set the house on fire. And it wasn't that she was like a pyromaniac. It was that, her personality just lit the whole place. When she came into a room, the whole place just lit up. So this idea of nicknaming is really, really powerful. Among the Kalenjin as well, I've shared with you many times, there were naming ceremonies when a little baby was born. And so a baby was given 3 different names in the course of the first 2 or 3 weeks after birth. And the first name had to do with the circumstances of the birth itself. And if you met a child and you asked what the name was, you could tell immediately the circumstances of the birth. So for instance, if I met a little girl and I said, Kigoreno, what is your name? And she says, Kigoreno Cherubet, my name is Cherubet. I knew immediately that she was born during a famine. That's what the name indicates, that she was born during a famine. If I met a little boy and he told me his name was Kimngeno, I knew that he was born when the goats were going out to the salt lick. So the name would tell you the circumstances of what was happening in the community at the time the baby was born. If a little girl was called Chipchirchir, I knew immediately that it was a very difficult birth, and it wasn't sure whether or not she'd survive. So the name would tell me that immediately. So that was the first name that was given. Within about 8 days of the birth, one of the elders of the group would be brought in, somebody who knew the ancestry of this baby, and the elder would begin naming off the ancestors sequentially, chronologically. And when the baby sneezed, they would say, that's the one. So that's the elder that's come back. So they believed in a form of reincarnation. So the elder had recognized that this is the name, that's what I want to be known at, I'm the guy who's coming back, and they'd call the child by that name. And then the third name was given, it was called the porridge name, Gainetab Musarek, and it was a special name that only the mother was allowed to use for the child. It was called a porridge name. So only the mother could use that name for the child. Nobody else was permitted to use that name. So these fabulous naming ceremonies. Again, like Elijah, many people would give themselves names. So in my time there, I did a lot of building. And for the foundations, we would use what was called kokoto. And kokoto was rocks that had just been broken up into gravel of various sizes, 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch. And it was a very laborious exercise because we didn't have any tools. So you'd literally just gather a pile of rocks and you'd sit beside them with one rock and you just pound them and break them up into kokoto. So very back-breaking work. And then they'd measure out debe by debe and you'd be paid according to what you'd broken. And normally it was big, strong guys of this. But one day, I'm building in a mission called Kipsarman, and this kid was about 12 years of age, came up and he says, I want to make kokoto. I'm looking at the size of him, small, frail little kid. And I said to him, Kigoreno, what is your name? And he says to me, Kigoreno, Maam Gau. And the whole crowd broke up into stitches laughing. All the men started laughing. Because Maam Gau literally means, I do not eat at home. My name is, I do not eat at home. And what he was indicating was he was totally self-sufficient. He was the eldest of about 6 or 7 kids, and the parents could not afford to send him to secondary school. The school fees were too high. So he was going out, breaking kokoto to earn his own school fees. And he changed his name to indicate, I'm totally self-sufficient, Maam Gau, I do not eat at home. I'm not dependent on my parents even for food. And I'm going to earn my school fees by breaking kokoto. And he did, and went to school. So naming within the Kalenjin was really powerful. We find it within the Aboriginal tradition that naming is really, really important because for the Aborigines, particularly of Australia, they believed that all of creation was sung into being by the ancestors, that literally the physical universe was sung into being by the songs of the ancestors. And before you had permission to travel in any place, to climb a mountain, to ford a stream, to walk through a forest, you had to know the song of the forest, or the song of the mountain, or the song of the river. It was unthinkable to try to traverse any terrain whose song you didn't know. And so being able to name the music and sing the music of the area was vital. So you can imagine what it looked like to them, the sacrilege it looked like to them when the whites came in and just started tramping all over the place without ever learning the music of the mountain or the music of the stream. It was desecration as far as they were concerned. So this naming is really, really huge. We see the very same thing happen in religious life. You know, in the old days, if somebody wanted to join a convent, 3 things happened. You got rid of your street clothes, your hair got cropped, and your name was changed. So it indicated a whole new life, a whole new identity, and a whole new mission. So changing the name was a hugely important part of that. And so trying to figure out what your name is a huge key to figuring out who you are and what your purpose is. And so on Sunday next, as we give this little girl that name, this will be part of trying to sing her mission into reality. So if you come next Sunday, that's what I'll hope that we'll contribute as a community, that we add our voices and our music, to try to help little Lucy Abando figure out who she is and what her purpose is, on planet Earth this time around. So that's my first point. Second point then is, I say, are you a child of the light? So there was this great passage in the Gospel of Thomas this morning where Jesus speaking to the disciples, and he says, if people ask you, where have you come from? Tell them, we have come from the light. So what does it mean to say that we are come from the light? And the truth is, we are come from the light. I had this very interesting vision at the end of last year where I saw a map of the Father, Son and Spirit, Sat Chitananda, generating this love. And that love really is cosmic consciousness. The best word for it scientifically, I think, is that love is cosmic consciousness. Love is the origin of everything that we find in our physical universe. But love gives birth to twins. And the twins are light and logos. And as you get different levels of subtlety or density of light and logos, light transforms slowly by slowly into matter of various densities and various subtleties, and logos, transforms slowly by slowly into different levels of mind. And so you have light and logos dancing together and becoming various levels of matter. Now, I'm convinced that that is the real meaning of the double helix. That the double helix is not just about physical DNA and their chromosomal structures, that this dance that happens between light and logos is literally, it's the cosmic brain coming from cosmic consciousness, which is love. And it is this dance of light and logos that creates all the different light forms. And any level of density of mind can connect with any level of density of light. And so you get very, very interesting life forms. So every life form is a particular connection between a logos form and a light form. So you get various levels of subtlety and various levels of density. If you get very, very subtle mind dancing with very, very subtle light, you get life forms that we might call angelic beings. And so they're really, really subtle, almost causal in the quality of their form. If you get rather dense mind interacting with rather dense light, you get human beings. If you get very, very dense light and very dense matter, you maybe have rocks. And so every single life form is simply a dance at some level between various levels of light and various levels of logos. Every life form that exists, whether it's extraterrestrials, whether it's dandelions, banana slugs, or avatars, all of them represent some life form that came together in the dance of light and logos. So all life comes from that source. And when life fully awakens, the only response to a life fully aware of itself and its essence is laughter. So there's the great story in Philip's Gospel that after Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, he came out of the river and he started laughing because it represented his the fullness of his enlightenment. The only valid response to coming fully awake is to belly laugh, not derisively, not sarcastically, but at the game that you realize you'd been playing, the illusions under which you had been laboring. And when you realize that you've finally broken through the illusion, all you want to do is laugh, at the game. Now, again, I say not sarcastically, not derisively, but just the sheer wonder and awe and curiosity of the fact that we've lived so much of our time in illusion within illusion within illusion. And if you finally crack those, you just want to belly laugh. And this is what Jesus does coming out of the Jordan. So all life forms represent this dance between light and logos. And to kind of jump forward 2 weeks to Easter Sunday, for me that's what resurrection represents. Resurrection didn't mean that Jesus reconstructed his molecular, system 3 days after he'd lain in the tomb, but that he released the light within him. Now it's an actual fact that we have about 10 to the power of 14 cells in the human body. Roughly about 50 trillion. So roughly 10 to the power of 14 cells in the human body. Each cell contains roughly 10 to the power of 14 atoms. So you've got 10 to the power of 28 atoms in a typical human body. And there's a photon of light attached to each. So if you could actually release the light in a single human body, we don't know how to do it. Although there are cases of spontaneous combustion, but we don't know how to, volitionally accomplish this. But if it could be done scientifically, there is enough light in a single human body to light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. Now, I really think that this extraordinary artifact, which is called the Shroud of Turin, and very, very recent evidence is showing that it is indeed a very, very ancient. It's not just going back 600 or 700 years, it's going back at least 2,000 years. Now, obviously some corpse was wrapped in this shroud. And somehow the impression of a crucified man was impregnated onto this shroud. And I'm totally convinced that what happened was that at the moment of resurrection, the light within this body just released in this kind of extraordinary burst of music. And it impregnated the cloth, radiated the cloth with the image of the one who had lain within it. So the resurrection was literally the releasing of the light. Because Christ had come from light, as you and I come from light, and we return to light. There is a teaching within Tibetan Buddhism, which is called the rainbow body. And it's the belief system, and allegedly has been actually witnessed, where a very advanced Lama, when he comes to dying, will sit in zazen, in meditation, and just drop the body. And what happens is, it disappears into what they call it a rainbow body. That what the observers see is there's nothing left. Occasionally they say there's hair and teeth left, but nothing else. But mostly everything disappears into a rainbow body, and there's just clothes left where they were. So for me, it's the same phenomenon. So that's who we really are. We are light beings. And the process of dying is the sequential disidentification with the denser levels of who we think we are. So the densest level of who we think we are is our physical selves, and the next level up is our etheric energy body, and the next level is the one that we use when we're dreaming at night. It's a kind of subtler level of body, but there's gradations all the ways up. And finally, when all the light is released, you recognize that you're soul, you're pure light from source, from love. So that's what I mean by are we children of the light? The third question then, how awake do you want to become? So I remember I was still working in the parish in Palo Alto, so it must have been pre-1995. And there was an old lady in the parish whom I befriended, and it came time for her to die, and she was up in Stanford Hospital. And I visited her up there several times. And I remember going to the hospital room one time, and she had an only child, a daughter, and the daughter was sitting on one side of the bed, and her husband, and I go around to the other side of the bed, and this lady had been in a coma for 3 or 4 days. So the daughter's holding her left hand, and I go around to the other side of the bed, pull up a chair, sit down, and I start holding her right hand. And all of a sudden her eyes opened, and she looked around with this amazed look, and she said, "What time did I die?" And the three of us kind of cracked up. She survived actually 2 more days after, and then she did die. But she, with this wondrous look, looked around and said, "What time did I die?" Now, the question that brought up for me is, how would you know if you were dead? How do you know if you were awake? How would you know if you were dreaming? How would you know if you were asleep and not dreaming? Do you have any proof right now that this isn't a dream? Any proof whatsoever? When you were sleeping last night and dreaming, you were totally convinced that that was real, in spite of the fact that there was no sensory input. You were creating your reality intracranially through your mind. There was no sensory input, but you were creating your reality, and you were totally convinced that that was real. How do you know that this is real? Maybe this is just a dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. I keep saying to you that life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. So we're in nested dreams. So how would you know if you were asleep or awake, or dead? How would you know? There are discombobulated entities that don't realize they're dead. They're now attached to an etheric body, but they want to get kind of connect up with that physical carcass lying on the side of the road right down there. So how would you know? It's very difficult. There's a few little tests, but you have to be aware enough to test. So for instance, if you're dreaming at night and you suddenly realize this is a dream, but you're not quite sure, there's actually a really simple test. If you go over to a solid object and you're dreaming and you try to put your fist through it, it'll go right through. And I've done this a few occasions just to make sure that when I was dreaming, it really was a dream, to check off myself, is this really a dream? And I go across to, on one occasion, a rock face, put my hand right through it. Because in your dreaming, you're not in your physical body, you're in an energy body, an etheric body that does not have density. And so you're able to move through it. So there's a simple test, but you have to be aware of the fact first that you are actually dreaming. Yeah. So, am I awake or asleep at this stage? Watch my hand. Okay. What's going to happen? Will it go through or will it stay on this side? It'll stay, you think? Okay. Good. You're still asleep, Deborah. I'm joking you, of course. But that's the truth. It's very difficult to know what state we're in. So how awake can we be? How would we know if we were asleep? Or how would we know if we were awake? And so all of the great teachers tell us that this is the real objective of life. It is to find out, are we asleep? Are we awake? Are we dreaming? Is this real? And so people like the Buddha, he'd give his name to this. He was born Gautama Siddhartha, but he identified himself as Buddha. I am awake. That was his realization, that he was fully awake. He knew what was up, and he knew what was down, and he knew what was in the middle. Jesus Christ, 550 years after him, would say the very same things. He would couch it in parable form. He would say, for instance, come to terms with your opponent while you're still on the road. or your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and he'll give you over to the jailer, and the jailer will put you in prison, and you won't get out until you pay the very last penny. Now, he's not talking about some, dispute about land between two neighbors. And he's not talking about a relationship to God. He's talking about the relationship between the ego and the soul. These are the opponents. And he's saying, come to terms with your opponent while you're still on the road. Wake up to who you really are while you're still on the road, or else you're going to be in prison all your life. Incarnation is a prison for those who don't realize that incarnation is a mission. Incarnation is either a mission or it's a jail. And it's a jail for those of us who are asleep, and it's a mission for those of us who wake up. And Christ is saying this very powerfully. Come to terms with your opponent while you're still on the road. While you're still incarnated, wake up already. Socrates would say it very powerfully. Socrates lived about 150 years after the Buddha. And he would say, man, know thyself, or the unexamined life is not worth living. Living asleep, is useless. But we live in a culture that's constantly trying to induce a soporific effectiveness, because only people who are asleep will consume, whatever they tell us we need to have, or life isn't worth living unless we have this particular product, whatever it is. So we're constantly bombarded with images to go to sleep, entertain them, and make them consume stuff so they don't really have to think about the larger issues of life. So waking up is what it's all about. And waking up is identifying. There are three basic questions to this, it seems to me. The first one is, who am I? And the second one is, who is my neighbor? And the third one is, what is my purpose? Or what is my mission? And so every single one of us, we're living life driven by some kind of an internalized model. I call it a personal cosmology. Every single one of us will respond to life circumstances in a particular way. What caused you to say that rather than the other? Why did you do that rather than something else? Because some internalized model said to you, that's the appropriate response in this situation. But where did you get that model from? You picked it up unconsciously from your parents, from the school system, from the mass media, from political process, but you had no control over what came in. And when you're in a situation, largely, you access it unconsciously. You don't make conscious choices often about the decision, about what you choose to say or do in situations. It's been driven by this internalized, unconscious personal cosmology. And so the objective of the exercise is to bring that to full consciousness. And when you do, you find out that there are elements of that cosmology that are crippling you. But there's no way you can know that as long as it's unconscious. You have no freedom or free will as long as that is unconscious. So there's an exercise I've proposed to you a few times that I give to all my clients. So what I ask them to do is this, write down the 10 commandments by which you live. And I don't mean the rules of the church or the commandments of Moses, and I do not mean your ideals. What are the 10 rules that actually drive your behavior? See, bring them to consciousness, write them down, and then divide them into two groups. Which of them are crippling you, and which of them are liberating you for life? Change these ones, substitute these with something else. But as long as we're living unconsciously, we're asleep at the wheel. We have no idea who we are. So bringing that to consciousness is the first step. And then when this brought to consciousness, we ask ourselves the three questions. Who am I? Who is my neighbor? What is my purpose? Now the question of who am I, actually, if you look at the synoptic gospels, that is the question which is almost mathematically precisely in the center of all three synoptic gospels. A story of Jesus on the road to Caesarea Philippi. And he's deep in thought. And the guys are a few yards behind him arguing about which of them is going to be the Minister for Defense and the Minister for Agriculture and the Minister for Education in the new parliament that Jesus is going to set up in Jerusalem. And Jesus stops all of a sudden, he lets them catch up and he says, who do people think that I am? And they say, some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're one of the Old Testament prophets. Some people think you're the Messiah. So he says, what about you guys? Who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you're the Mashiach. You're the Son of the living God. Now Christ had been asking the other question, obviously on his own. Who do I think that I am? Now there's a different version of that story in one of the Gnostic Gospels. In the Gospel of either Philip or Thomas. I don't remember which right now. No, Thomas actually. And he asks the same question to the disciples. He says, who do you think that I am? And in this particular version, Thomas the Virtual, Matthew says, I think you are a wise sage. And then he says to Levi, who do you think that I am? He says, I think you are an angel. And he gets 3 or 4 different responses. And then he says to Thomas, who do you think that I am? And Thomas says, my mouth cannot say what I think you are. And Jesus looking at him, and he realizes this guy gets it. So he calls him aside, and they go over and they have a private conversation, out of earshot of the others. And after a few minutes, Thomas comes back, and they say to him, what did he say to you? And Thomas says, if I tell you what he said to me, you'll take up stones and you'll stone me to death. So what did Jesus say to Thomas that he was afraid to report to the other guys, because they'd literally stone him to death? I tell you what he said to him. Jesus said to him, who are you? And he said, I'm Thomas. Jesus says, no. Who are you? And Thomas got it. Thomas said, I'm a son of God. And Jesus says, bingo. He comes back to the guys and they say, what did he say to you? Now if Thomas is going to say, I am the son of God, they're going to stone him. You're not thinking that this megalomaniac all of a sudden. He's afraid to tell them. So that is the secret. Every single one of us is a child of God. Every single one of us, that's who we really are. So there's only one question to, who am I? I'm a bite-sized piece of God having a human experience. I'm a soul in safari on planet Earth. I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. If I think I am my body, I'm lost. If I think I am my emotions, I'm lost. If I think I am my ideas, I'm lost. If I think I am my personality, or the job I do, or the relationships I'm in, I'm lost. These are things I do as a part of incarnation, but they're not who I am. Every single one of us can answer that question the very same way that Jesus answered it, and the way that Thomas answered it. You are no less important in the eyes of God than Jesus was, or Thomas was, or anybody else. You're as much a child of God and a spark of light and of divinity as Thomas was, or Jesus was. So answering that question is very important. Otherwise we go through life identifying with the spacesuit. It's like we think we are the spacesuit that we're wearing. And then the second question becomes, who is my neighbour? If you really understand that you are the child of God, then ipso facto you recognize that everything else is the child of God as well. There is nothing which is not the child of God. There is nothing which is not a word of God become flesh. And then, all animosity, all greed, all competition breaks down. How can you compete with yourself? Because there is only the self. There's only God in different guises. So the notion of neighbour becomes very, very different. It's a very different notion from what you find in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, where there's one law for the 12 tribes of Israel, and then there's a different law for people outside. You can kill them with impunity. In fact, you're meant to kill them, to wipe them out. It was called the ban. When you made war against a group, you had to kill every man, every woman, every child. That was the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, that was the law. We operate with the same law right now. There's not a single colonialist power on planet Earth that didn't operate from the same law. There's one law for the group, and there's a different law from those outside. And all our foreign policies are based on this misidentification of who the neighbour is. There can be no greed, there can be no warfare, there can be no competition for resources if we realise who our neighbour really was. And then the final piece becomes, the third question is, then what is my mission? And the mission is to wake up. And then to help wake others up, and finally to introduce Christ consciousness into our world and into our times. And so in actual fact, if you get the correct answer to any of these three questions, you have the answer to the other two as well. If you really know who you are, then you know who your neighbour is and you know what your mission is. If you really know what your mission is, you know who your neighbour is and you know who yourself is. If you know who your neighbour is, you know who you are and you know what your mission is as well. So waking up is the key. So when we baptize little Lucy Abando on Sunday next, those of you who are here, I want you just to call that to mind. That is what we were promising to this child. That we'll try to wake up ourselves and we'll try to create a culture and an environment in which this little child can also wake up to the light that she is.